Today, I'm going to show you two mistakes that are very easy to make in React that revolve around using the useEffect hook. And luckily, they're very avoidable mistakes. Now, if you're not familiar with how useEffect works, I have videos on how this hook works and when you might want to use it. So feel free to check those out because I'm going to assume some familiarity with this hook. The first mistake that we're going to go over is when you use the useEffect hook during a user event or an event handler. So in this code here, we have a button down below. When they click this button, we call this handle by function. And then what we do is we set a product in our state, and then we use a useEffect hook here to track when a product changes. And then it makes an API request when that product changes to effectively maybe make a post request to your backend to say user just bought a certain product. The kind of issue here is that when using effects or the useEffect hook, you don't need to use it when you're just like responding to some user action. That is kind of event handler code. You don't need to use effects for that. Effects are more so going to be to synchronize third-party systems. Maybe you connect to WebSockets, different things like that. You don't need to use useEffect when it's just responding to some user actions. So although this might work in some situations, I think you're just making things way more complicated than they need to be by setting a product. Okay, now the product has changed, so we put that in the dependency array. If the product changes, we are going to make an API call here to buy the product. Like there could definitely be bugs with this where what if they buy the same product twice, but the product in your array doesn't actually change and it doesn't get triggered again, or there could be a host of issues with this. And then also you kind of have to understand, like just tracking this code, it can be kind of tricky to understand where, okay, we call handle by, but all we do is set a product. Okay. And then when we set the product, what else is depending on the product? Okay, this useEffect hook depends on this product. So if the product changes and it isn't null or it is a truthy value, then we fetch this post. This can be far simplified to where in our more correct way to do this, we just handle all that code in our onClick. We trigger this handle by function, but then we just call this API endpoint directly in our handle by function. So we don't have to worry about state. We don't have to worry about a useEffect hook. We don't have to even know how any of that stuff works. It's just like, okay, the user clicks this button, then we make our API request. And of course, maybe you do have some state here, or when they click handle by, you pass in an argument of the product ID that they want to buy, and then you pass that along here. But in a case to where a user is just doing some action, like buying a product or clicking a button or hovering over something, some user action, that can often just be handled in some sort of event handler function like we're doing here, rather than trying to handle really anything in a useEffect. As really useEffect is to kind of step out of normal React code when you like absolutely need to. And if you don't need to use it, I think it's best practice to not use it. So that's the first example. If it's user event code, just handle it right in that user event, right when the user clicks on that on click, or on that on whatever action it is, handle the code that you need to do right away directly rather than kind of indirectly through a useEffect. Now, number two is definitely one that I've seen before in production code, but say you have a list of data or you have some data and then you want to process that data in some way. So maybe you want to filter that list or sort it, or maybe you need to map over that list to remove some characters or make strings title case, whatever it might be. Well, one way that you might think about handling this after learning about the useEffect hook is that, okay, if you have this list of data, then if you want a filtered list, you can use another piece of state and then just use a useEffect hook to track your list. So if our list changes, then we are going to set our filtered list to a new filtered list based on this list. So if that sounds like a lot, we just have this list of data and then we have a filtered list piece of state. Our useEffect is going to track when the list changes, our original list changes, And then when it does change, we are going to set our filtered list piece of state to our original list, but then filtering that in some way or processing that in some way. Now, again, this can work in a variety of situations, but it's just simply not needed. Like anytime you're using a useEffect to just change some state based on another piece of state, you probably don't need that useEffect. And again, if we don't need to use them, like as you can see, like just trying to explain that out loud to you of what's going on here is much more complex compared to in our after example. We have our list of data, which of course could be some state, or maybe it's some props that are passed to this component. But then we don't need to create another piece of state for this. We just can create another variable, just a JavaScript variable, const filtered list. And then we just do our filtering directly right here at the top level of our application. So we don't need to use a useEffect. We don't need to use a different piece of state. We just say, hey, okay, we have this list here, and let's just filter it directly and into another variable. And this is going to work just fine because, say we also had like a set list function and we were occasionally setting this list to something else. Well, when you set state, it's going to re-render the component. So it's going to reinitialize this variable here, and it's going to refilter the list and stay up to date. That's going to be perfectly okay to do because when this changes, it's going to re-render and we're going to create this new variable, refilter the list when it re-renders. So we are just deriving this piece of state here, this piece of data from some other state. And anytime you're doing that, you don't really need to use a useEffect. You can just do it directly like what we're doing here, rather than kind of indirectly doing it through your useEffect. So these are two common examples that I've definitely seen in professional code of, stuff that can work. Like I'm not saying like you're a bad developer or anything like that. If you write your code like this, I've probably made mistakes like this. But I just think this is a mistake because it's not necessary. You don't need to actually use effects here. This is unnecessary code here. It's unnecessary code here. You can greatly simplify both of these cases by handling user actions directly in the event handler and just handling that code directly, as well as just deriving a variable from your piece of state or from props. That's perfectly acceptable to do and much more simplified compared to, using a useEffect, using another piece of state and just making things a little bit harder than they need to be. This definitely isn't the only couple of mistakes that you can make. And I'm going to go over some more stuff related to useEffect because it is a little bit tricky. And just to kind of show you that I'm not crazy here, React covers this directly in their docs to remove unnecessary effects. For example, you don't need effects to transform data when rendering, just like our list example here. We're transforming this list data here while rendering in like the top level of our component. We don't need an effect for that. We can just do that directly right here instead of writing this effect code. And then also you don't need effects to handle user events, just kind of like what the example I showed you, to where in our before button, we don't need an effect to handle this user event. We can handle that directly in the event handler function because effects are really just needed to synchronize with external systems, not necessarily for kind of this stuff here. So hopefully that was clear. Hopefully that helps, and I'll see you in that next one.